Well, thank you, Dave, and thank you, IWP, for the invitation to talk on my book and the issue of politicization of U.S. intelligence. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you two short stories about myself related to this. First, in 1986, I was an analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. I was working on Eastern Europe, and my colleagues and I one day received instruction that we should add additional negative adjectives and make in essence the East European communist countries look worse than they really were. We were not coddling the East Germans or the Hungarians, but we were told that the then director of the analysis directorate, Bob Gates, wanted us to make these people look worse. This was politicization to us, and it generated some unpleasant conversations. And I've been very sensitive to the issue of politicization ever since, so that when we began to see it again in 2016, I was quite attuned to it. And secondly, a lot of people think that because I'm criticizing the politically active people in the intelligence community who have criticized candidate and then President Trump, that I am a Trump supporter. That is not the case. I did not vote for Mr. Trump in 2016 or 20. I do not intend to vote for him again in 2024. This issue, this study, and my talk here is about the attitudes and the actions, the politically important attitudes and actions of current and former intelligence officers and their consequences. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So what are we talking about when we're talking about politicization? There are two definitions, really. One that is used occasionally is the so-called top-down politicization. Every once in a while, a president will say to intelligence, now I want you to write something, and here's what I want you to say. But that's very unusual. Normally, the top-down variant involves the use of intelligence in political battles in Washington on Capitol Hill. This actually is a measure of the usefulness of intelligence. If this kind of thing were not happening, then intelligence wouldn't be useful. Far more important is the bottom-up variety. This is what intelligence officers are told from their first days on the job. You will not inject personal, political views into your intelligence products. It is completely inappropriate to try to slant intelligence to serve individual or group interests. But that, in fact, has happened, and that's the subject of our discussion here today. Next. There have been 4 cases in U.S. history. The first 3 are relatively minor. The second one is the one that I just talked about, the one that I experienced. The first 2 were not public at the time, became publicly available only years later. The third one was slightly public at the time, but none of the first 3 made a major difference on U.S. politics, on the political system in the country. The fourth one, the last one, is vastly different, much bigger, and much more significant. So that's what we'll talk about here today. Next. This is the beginning of our current episode. So Michael Morell, former deputy CIA director, career intelligence analyst, opted to write an op-ed in the New York Times in August of 2016, just after Donald Trump was anointed the Republican nominee. And this is among the things that he wrote. This is actually incorrect, either a purposeful misrepresentation or a misrepresentation anyway, in 2 respects. First, Morell and all other intelligence officers do indeed call it as they see it regarding foreign intelligence issues. But he's talking here about domestic issues. That is not a CIA job. And secondly, no CIA officer ever recommends policy to Americans, much less recommending recommending the policy decision of a voter choice. So this would be the first of a number of cases in which truth became an issue, both on the part of Mr. Trump and also on the part of his critics. Next, please. So the rather large reaction to Morell's comment, and then the many other comments and leaks that began soon thereafter, led me very quickly, especially given my sensitivity from 1986, to think that there are three important questions that needed to be answered from a social science perspective. First, what exactly is new? I mean, attitudes and activities completely inconsistent with what we've seen before. What exactly is happening here, and where in the sense of what organizations, which agencies? How and why did these these new activities occur? They didn't happen by accident. What's the origin of them? And then thirdly, what are the implications, long, short, and in many ways? So as a political scientist, I tried to address this from a social science perspective, and did the sorts of things that social scientists normally do. I looked at the vast amount of open source literature, books, articles, television interviews, and so on. I did about 15 semi-structured interviews with knowledgeable people, but I also had two other big advantages that were unique to me and relatively few other people. First, I'd spent 12 years at the Central Intelligence Agency as an analyst, another 4 years at the National Intelligence University, relatively recently, so I knew a lot about the internal workings of the IC, the intelligence community, and I also knew a lot of people. And those people, several dozen of them, helped me a lot in providing information about what was going on. So those additional factors have helped dramatically, I think, in this study. Next. So what's new? First, intelligence officers cite their intelligence credentials for a large number of views, including partisan political views. So you just saw an example of that in terms of Morell. That would occur repeatedly in the comments of other people. Unlike in the past, formers especially, but some leakers talk in very self-righteous terms that they know truth. They know truth that others don't. They resurrected the 1960s version slogan, truth to power. They decided that they would talk their truth to Mr. Trump's power. And they said repeatedly that they felt a moral obligation to share this version of truth with the world, indeed. And then thirdly, they defended themselves vigorously. In the past, intelligence officers had recognized that they made mistakes, and they often took the fall for presidential policy failures, but that is no longer the case. There was a strong defense of the agencies against the alleged assault on intelligence by Donald Trump. And some of them indeed flatly said, we deserve respect as individuals and as organizations as, in essence, a property right. All of those things dramatically new. Next. So where did it happen? Mainly in the 2016-21 period. It was at the CIA and at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI. Well, you see a number of bits of evidence to that effect. DNI Jim Clapper was an influence on the ODNI, but there was not a real internal politicization activity within the agencies elsewhere. The FBI situation was considerably different. Some of the senior people who complained about Mr. Trump and wrote books about them, Director Jim Comey, Andrew McCabe, the deputy director, and so on, complained in pretty different terms. Their complaints were largely personal, related to the fact that Trump had fired them. But there also were counterintelligence concerns. So the FBI began to look in 2016 at charges that the Trump campaign and maybe even Donald Trump himself were compromised from the counterintelligence perspective vis-a-vis Russia. That all turned out to not be the case. The other agencies were only modestly affected until 2021. I found no evidence that they were active at all, really, in that 16 to 21 period. That now has changed. The Biden administration is moving pretty aggressively to politicize the agencies of the government as a whole, including the IC agencies. So we'll come back to that and talk just a little bit about that. Next. There's six reasons I found why there would be the changes we talked about. So I want to talk about three of those, the three that are in red. The listing here is, generally speaking, in chronological order. They are not all of similar importance. The demographics is an important one, and two on the next slide are important too. So I want to talk about demographics, President Obama's policies, and then also the policies of some senior leaders, particularly DNI Clapper and CIA Director John Brennan. Next, please. Demographic changes. So there was a significant change in the demography of the intelligence community after 2001. The intelligence community, like the Defense Department, received lower budgets in the 1990s as part of the peace dividend. And in the IC, there were fewer hires. The head count on the workforce declined. And so there were simply relatively few new people coming in the 1990s. After 9/11, President Bush directed the IC to get considerably bigger to fight the terrorist threat. And as a result, the agencies brought in a large number of mainly younger people who had importantly different collective views on a number of things, who very quickly changed the organizational cultures of many of the agencies, especially including CIA. The important ones were social issues, issues particularly related to race, to gender, to sexual orientation, and so on. These were much more important to these younger people, and they made it clear that those were serious concerns. They also had some lesser respects for traditional norms that were important in the intelligence community, including the ability, the importance of maintaining security. And a number of these people became considered to be so-called insider threats, counterintelligence threats. A number of them also expressed the idea that as sharp people, they had the right to express themselves publicly. You combine the two of those together, and you get the leak situations of Ed Snowden and Bradley Manning, as he was known at the time. And not least, and related to these other 2 points, is that their schooling in the past had been that their job as good citizens was to convey to the rest of the world their views and to help change the world in a positive way. So these characteristics were relevant to senior leaders who had similar ambitions. So next slide, please. An important senior leader who wanted to transform the United States was President Obama. He made it clear from the time of his campaign. Senator Obama in October of 2008 promised to transform the United States if he became president. He made it clear from the very beginning that he wanted the federal government as a good place to start. He wanted to make the federal government look like America. And he did that initially, but one of the most important ways he did that was through this executive order 13583, which, unlike a lot of executive orders, was an important one in the sense that it actually had some power. So it created diversity offices in all federal agencies, including IC agencies. These offices had power. They had power to mandate accountability of senior managers and to exert sanctions if there were failures to comply with hiring and general treatment policies associated with the executive order. There was clearly an effort to change the organizational culture of the government as a whole, and that had ramifications within the IC as well in terms of both changing organizational cultures and also changing the demography of the workforce. Obama couldn't do all that by himself, so he needed some help, and it started from the very beginning. DCIA Panetta made the announcement in summer of 2009 that there would be a big hiring of minorities. But his best helpers were Clapper and Brennan, the two men that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So DNI James Clapper was Obama's second and last DNI. He made it clear in his book, you can see the cover there on the lower right, that he was a longtime supporter of principles that later became known as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as DNI, he did a number of things that were important, and I think you can divide them into two categories. First, he promulgated a number of policies or directives and so on, such as the one you see there, strategy for doing diversity for coming years for the future, and he also implemented and in many cases initiated a series of events that were consistent with the overall policy intent. And these particularly emphasize the importance of supporting and promoting hiring and so on, the favored demographic groups of the Obama administration. So this would be women, minorities, gays, and eventually people with disabilities. This policy also changed the demography of the government appreciably. There were clear incentives to alter the demographic profile, and there were changes in the Clapper years, although not enough for him. He expressed unhappiness in January 2017 with the progress that he had made, and made a written report which continues. You can see an annual report along these lines published every year since, which indicates the success at changing the demographic composition of the intelligence community. So he was important in that respect. Next please. So some other observations about him. He was one of the ones who said he had a moral duty to warn against President Trump. So this is another case of a misrepresentation by intelligence people to the community as a whole, the country as a whole. And in the intelligence business, you don't warn about events that have already occurred. The purpose of warning is to alert about future events. But I see people were warning about Donald Trump for 4 years. He also was a very active person in the anti-Trump campaign after he left office in January of 2017. Signer of open letters, and he leaked quite a bit. He made a number of statements that are just pretty obviously wrong. You see several of them there. And later on, he became a paid political commentator for CNN and talked regularly during the Trump years about all kinds of subjects for CNN, which was one of the major anti-Trump news media. Next, please. John Brennan was the second and also important contributor here. Brennan was a career CIA officer, mainly an analyst, although he did a little bit in the operations world. He made it clear in his book, you see cover on the lower right, that he intended to change CIA's organizational culture, and he aimed to change it in a way consistent with goals of President Obama. He made a number of internally overt changes in the way CIA hired, promoted, and awarded employees that remain in effect. He gave preferences to hiring women in 2013. The result of that, since that policy has continued, is that the CIA workforce now is slightly over, last I looked, slightly over 50% female. That means that CIA's workforce has more women as a percentage than the workforce of the federal government as a whole and of the economy as a whole. But the preferences remain. Same thing for minorities. There were clear preferences. There was an effort to encourage LGBTQ people, and not only that, Brennan regularly cajoled his employees to be politically active. So or in the wake of the win by Trump in November of 2016, Brennan had two meetings in the CIA auditorium in which he told his employees, fight the new Trump administration and make sure that you do not do things that, or do not allow things to happen that would interfere with the progress, word that he used, the progress that he had made on DEI issues. So in the next slide, you'll see a quotation. Next slide, please. This is a measure of the importance that Brennan and implicitly others put on the DEI agenda. So in Brennan's last week in office in January 17, he talked to a Wall Street Journal reporter, and he talked not about the wonderful things that CIA had done in the analysis world and the collection world and so on. Talked about how his important contribution had been in the DEI area. And he said that he told his employees that they should seize the opportunity and make sure that bad things didn't happen to interfere with this progress. So this was not a passing thing. He actually said basically the same thing in his book. There's a quotation in the book that is very, very close to what was published in the Wall Street Journal. Next slide, please. So the result of all of this, putting this together, I think we can say that the origin of the politicization that emerged dramatically in 2016 was ongoing from the early days of the Obama administration. CIA had traditionally been a liberal organization, to be sure, but not an activist organization. So between the changes of the EO of 2011, Brennan's policy and so on, you had a real change in the organizational culture at CIA, but it was not overt because until mid-2016, most people in the intelligence community, like most people in the country, thought that Hillary Clinton would become president in January of 2017 and would continue Obama's policies, which many at CIA liked. But when Trump became a coherent and threatening candidate, that there was a possibility that the progress might be reversed, then the intelligence officers within and outside the intelligence community decided that they needed to energize and to act against this threat. Next, please. So among the new formers, there were particularly Clapper and Brennan became formers and were free to speak on January the 20th of 2017. Brennan quickly became the face and the voice of intelligence community opposition to Trump. And Brennan quickly also became a very active Twitter user, and he engaged in tweet battles with the now president. You can see here some of the comments that he made. These are arguably pretty outrageous in some important respects, and pretty quickly generated a lot of negative reaction. I mentioned that I had about 15 structured interviews. In about 10 of those, I talked about the role that Brennan had in the anti-Trump campaign. None of those 10 thought that these kinds of comments were helpful to the anti-Trump campaign. And in some cases, there were some public commentary along the same lines. So you can see one of them here on the next slide. So this is John Cipher, a former CIA operations officer, a senior person, and clearly an anti-Trump person. But he's also saying, "Hey, John Brennan, you're making this too much about yourself. You really ought to stop doing this." He in fact did not. So Trump continued on Brennan continued to do this throughout the Trump administration. Next, please. So we've talked so far about former intelligence officers. There was a lot of activity by current ones too. Current intelligence officers cannot go on television like the formers can, but they can tell vocal formers about what they think and let them do some talking for them. The press, to its imaginative initiative, created anonymous sites for people to leak information. And of course, they could do the old traditional method of simply talking with journalists. A lot of what the IC employees did was leak information that was derogatory to Trump or his employees, his appointees, particularly Mike Pompeo, who was the first director of CIA in the Trump years. Pompeo was DCIA for about 15 months. A lot of the leaks were actually incorrect. They were what's known in the intelligence business as disinformation. They were incorrect leaks designed purposefully to generate negative views of targets. In terms of magnitude, there were at least 3 serious studies done to try to identify just how much more leaking was done. Attorney General Sessions in Trump's first year found that the rate of increase was on the order of 6 to 7 times. So it really was Trump's first 5 1/3 months in office, January 20 to June 30th. Senator Ron Johnson asked his staffers on the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee to look into this too, and there were slightly different criteria used. These folks looked at the first 5 months of the Trump administration compared to the first 5 months of the Obama administration in 2009. Found that there was a leak about every day in the Trump years versus about once a week in the Obama years, so a factor, again, of about 7. And the Federation of American Scientists used a different method and came up with the same basic pattern. There was a lot more leaking in the Trump years. Plus, there were quite a number of anecdotal stories along those lines that were less rigorous. Next, please. One of the major elements and the bones of contention in this criticism was the issue of truth. Did did Donald Trump speak truth? He had a reputation for having what I call casual respect for facts, but intelligence people also had some major problems in terms of telling just out and out untruths, arguably lies, and damage their credibility as a result. Among the key points here that resurrected the truth to power slogan, this was part of the original politicization effort going back to the 1960s. And they clearly were saying, we intelligence officers know truth, and we're going to shove that truth at Donald Trump's power. But again, there were a number of cases of misrepresentation or lying. You can see several of them there. And again, there was a real misrepresentation, not so much lying, but a misrepresentation of the warning function. Warning is about the future, not about the present and the past. And indeed, intelligence is never really about the truth. It's about trying to help generate foresight, to reduce uncertainty, to help decision makers make better decisions. It's not about finding the truth. And this is not a new comment, and people really do pretty much know that. You can see two adjectives used there by very prominent and respected former intelligence analysts. I'm particularly fond myself of the term arrogant, but that's still being used. Next, please. So here's the real origin, as best I can tell, of the use of the truth to power mantra, the slogan, if you will, and it goes back quite a long time, to the late 1950s, when Director of Central Intelligence Allen Dulles, who was a long-serving DCI in the 1950s, told the people who were building the new CIA headquarters building in the late 1950s that he wanted this biblical phrase engraved on the entryway at CIA headquarters. But we know now from Ray Klein, who was the head of the analysis directorate at the time, that Dulles had no intent whatever of making this a domestically oriented slogan. That his point was that CIA was then in a bitter, brutal, tough fight with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union lied a lot. It used disinformation. The CIA was going to help spread truth and help make other people and Americans free. Nothing to do whatever with domestic politics. Next, please. So was there a Trumpian assault on intelligence? This is another one of the standard complaints of the activists against candidate and then President Trump. And you can see that former CIA Director Michael Hayden actually named his book, his second book, The Assault on Intelligence. But there really was not such a thing, despite the claims. Even with a title, Hayden does not say in his book that Trump started it. This was a question that a friend of his in Pittsburgh asked him, a childhood friend. Hey, Mike, this fellow said, who started the Trump IC problem? And Hayden says, well, it wasn't Trump. Clapper in his book says the same thing. Did Trump cut the IC budgets? No, the requests were steadily higher, and the actual monies appropriated went up pretty regularly in Trump's years. Trump did not ask any of his DNIs or CIA directors to try to reform, to shape up, to shake up any of the IC agencies. There was nothing whatever. And to make sure that would not happen at CIA, he named Gina Haspel, career CIA operations officer, to be the CIA director. There wasn't a chance in the world that she was going to do that. And for that, and then on top of that, we know that Trump was often very positive in his commentary about intelligence officers, but he was very different than many previous presidents, whereas a president like Nixon, for example, would say nice things about intelligence publicly, but be very disparaging in private. Trump was the opposite. So that gave intelligence officers especially reasons to complain about him. Next. There was a major and a very unusual alliance between intelligence officers, the press, and the House Intelligence Committee, the HIPC, in the second 2 years of the Trump administration, and they provided mutual support, and I think to some degree used each other as well. The important thing from intelligence officer standpoint was that anti-Trump press, particularly the Washington Post and the New York Times, as well as a number of the electronic media, were very willing to give them opportunities to write negative things about Trump. And lots of interviews and at least 17 paid positions by anti-Trump former intelligence officers. The media in turn, the anti-Trump media in turn used these intelligence officers against Trump. After all, they made the point abundantly clear repeatedly: intelligence officers know lots about all sorts of things, and they are credible witnesses against the evils of the Trump administration. And then there was, again, unusually a clear alliance between the HIPC and particularly Chairman Adam Schiff and intelligence officers. There was a lot of help. The most prominent example is the 2019 case in which the HIPC staff helped the whistleblower who eventually led to Trump's first impeachment to figure out a way to make sure that his information became as public as possible. Next, please. So another of the issues that arose this time from the Trump side of things was the allegation that there was a deep state. So we see lots of activity by intelligence officers, the collaboration with the press and the HIPC and so on. Did that mean that there was a deep state of any sort? There are two general varieties in the literature. One is the kind that you see discussed in countries like Turkey or Pakistan or Thailand, in which security services are willing to fight established leaders, sometimes violently. There also is a so-called permanent government literature in the political science literature here in the United States about the ways in which government agencies will fight each other over responsibilities, turf and budget, and kudos for doing a good job, and so on. But neither of those is really relevant to, I think, what happened in the 2016 and earlier period that became clear in 2016. And here are some of the differences that I think are important. First is that it really was a top-down creation. So President Obama and Clapper and Brennan and others really created this, mainly in the form of the diversity offices. That means that there's relatively little structure. That means that this is not a strong deep state of the sort that you see in the third world, but it also has a strength in the sense that it's really hard to identify who's a part of it, and that will mean that fighting it, if one wants to do that, will be difficult. In the 2016-21 period, it was strongest at CIA and the ODNI. I think it's getting stronger elsewhere now. It was never challenged in the Trump years, and certainly is not being challenged in the Obama period. So the upshot here is that it is intact. It thinks with some justification that it helped to defeat Trump in 2020. And I think a stronger deep state remains available and willing to reactivate if necessary in 2024. Next, please. Here's a comment about the deep state. A little surprised that John McLaughlin, a career CIA analyst, would say that. He knew that it would be quoted by the press and by people like me. But when he said this, thank God for the deep state, he was talking clearly about CIA. There's no doubt about it in the context of his comments. Next. There were a number of episodes of politicization that grabbed the attention of the press and certainly of Mr. Trump's supporters. One of the most obvious ones that's become clear now is the so-called what I call anyway, the Laptop 51 case. So as many of you know, in the fall of 2020, a technician found that on Hunter Biden's laptop, there were a number of indications, documents that indicated that there might be a corruption problem involving both Hunter and members of his family, including his father. There was a story about this in the New York Post in mid-October 2020, right before the election. So this threatened a November surprise, October surprise, and had the potential to derail Mr. Biden's presidential ambitions. So the Biden campaign, in the form of Antony Blinken, who was a senior campaign official at the time, later Secretary of State, asked Michael Morell, whose comment you saw earlier, and Mark Polymeropoulos to try and come up with a letter from former senior intelligence officers that would indicate that's the information that the New York Post presented was probably Russian disinformation. So Morell and Polymeropoulos solicited a number of former intelligence officers, eventually got 51 signatures, including their own. One of the people who I talked to who received a solicitation said that the solicitation explicitly stated that the letter was designed to help the Biden campaign. So this was the story. The Post story was stifled by the legitimate press, by social media, until after the 2020 election, helping to preserve the election of President Biden. Next, please. So was Trump eventually angry at intelligence? Absolutely. He said repeatedly to a number of people he wasn't very happy. The term coup came up over 2016 allegations in the so-called Steele dossier. There also were a number of other cases later on. And he specifically labeled Brennan as a very bad person for the leaks that you saw. So it's not too surprising that he would do that. And also he expressed unhappiness with his daily briefers. So the PDB, the president's daily briefers, historically have been very, very, very tight-lipped. But these people did in fact leak. Trump came to learn of it, and he wasn't very happy with it. So all of this said, he nevertheless kept large numbers of intelligence people at the White House. He kept getting his daily briefings. He interacted with intelligence people pretty regularly, consistent with the sort of norm of presidents, and he still praised people on occasion. So he was not a person who turned off the intelligence flow at all, really, although he certainly could have. Next, please. So let's talk a little bit about the costs here. These are non-trivial. The most important of these, I think, is that the purposeful effort to change the organizational culture of the intelligence community has damaged its analytic objectivity. In the past, there was an effort made to acquire a wide range of different views, to encourage diversity of thought, not necessarily diversity of demography, and tough debates were the norm, and there was a so-called review process that was used to ensure that errors of all sorts, including biases, were expunged from analytic products before they were eventually published. So we know from the historical literature that when there are groups of people, when there are organizational cultures that begin to take specific views, and when cognitive closure occurs, when a group decides it's already got the definitive understanding on a complicated issue, that mistakes are made. And we know that some intelligence officers have said in the past, I really don't like this closure. John Gannon, who was a former senior CIA analyst, head of the analysis directorate, and also the head of the National Intelligence Council, told me that he used his national intelligence officer for warning as a prod of organizational, of analytic organizations that would not continue to think about difficult issues. So there are a number of cases here. We know about quite a number of them. You see some of them there. Let me talk about just one of them that happened in January of 2021. So the ODNI Analytic Ombudsman, who then was Barry Zuloff, wrote a letter to Senate Intelligence Committee, which is online. You can find it, in which he said, among other things, that China analysts within the IC were refusing to send intelligence information to the Trump White House because they thought that this information would help administration policies, and they did not want to help the Trump administration. And Zuloff called them out on that. And there were a number of others. This became a major concern of Robert Jervis, now the late Robert Jervis, formerly of Columbia University, longtime student of U.S. intelligence, who argued that this damage to analytic objectivity was probably the biggest concern, the biggest unknown also about the politicization of recent years. We do not know how much and how badly this politicization has occurred, because most intelligence reporting is classified, of course. It's not been released, and the intelligence community refused to examine the issue. So my expectation is that we will not see a serious external look at this issue until after another major intelligence failure. Next, please. Another key element here was the issue of the balkanization of the workforce. So demography, major point in the alteration of the IC. This was one of Obama's major goals: make the government, make the IC look like America. So you've created now a dozen or so so-called employee resource groups, which are made up of demographic groups. So these are people who are separated. They're supposed to be safe, but in fact, this encourages divisions among the workforce. And just a few examples here on the bottom there. Even during the Brennan years at CIA, the policies of Brennan, the push down of DEI policies, created what a number of analysts were calling soft totalitarianism. So they remembered, some of them experienced the totalitarianism of the Soviet years. Many of them knew about China, and they saw what Brennan was doing was being a modest version, a soft version of the control, really, that totalitarian states make. Later on, a senior retired analyst told me, this was a fellow who retired from very senior positions, was still working as an annuitant and an important part of the intelligence community. And he said this, let me just read this: political correctness rules. With the increased political divide, it is hard to be outspoken. We choose our close colleagues carefully. This is a devastating critique of management. One of the core requirements, really, of the intelligence business for many, many years. And one of its core characteristics that I experienced was that people needed to work together. These are difficult problems, and you need to have people who work together, who aren't scared of violating ideological rules. But quite a number of people have told me that that is now a significant problem. It's also been implemented at the State Department. There are literally monthly awards ceremonies at state, including at the State Intelligence Organization on INR, where people get points for doing things that are politically correct. For example, putting pronouns on one's signature block on email. This is dividing the workforce in yet another way. A number of people are quite happy with this, but a number of people are not. So divisions are occurring within the workforce now on ideological grounds as well as others. Next, please. And there are some others. A core one is the issue of trustworthiness. If intelligence is perceived to be politicized, it's going to damage the trustworthiness, the credibility of intelligence, and perhaps the government as a whole. Intelligence that's not trusted will not be used. And this is a serious long-term problem for the utility of the intelligence community as a whole. Activists undoubtedly think they succeeded, as I mentioned, and since there's been no effort to alter the organizational cultures, the deep state or whatever it is that arose in 2016 is still there, stronger than before. And again, I think we can expect to see it arise when it is quote needed to do defense of views that are deemed to be important. Next. So here's a relatively recent statement of the continuing view, in this case, CIA Director Burns, about the importance of DEI-related issues. So this was part of a memo to CIA retirees. Next, please. A speculative issue, but one that generated a lot of attention in the early Biden years was an interview that John Brennan had on MSNBC television, and he basically is saying here that the Biden administration might turn the foreign intelligence services against domestic enemies, or at least that's the way it's been interpreted in a number of quarters. I have not seen, any activity by the Biden administration to do this, and there are a lot of intelligence officers who think that what Brennan said here is really a bad idea. But the fact that it's now it's publicly been stated by a prominent person, leaves a number of people still wondering about whether this in fact will happen in the future. Next. So put all this together, key points. Elements of the IC are in fact politicized. CIA and the ODNI in the Trump years. Since that time, Biden's people have improved from their perspective the politicization of other parts of the government. This was intentional. In the Trump years, it was intentional. It was a result of Obama policies and those of Brennan and Clapper in particular. In that respect, Trump was a victim. So he came along at a time when he became a threat to this growing deep state, if you will, and which then reacted to him because he seemed to be a threat. As I've said several times, there's been no effort to address this issue. So the proverbial deep state is alive and stronger and waiting on a need for it to emerge again. Next, please. And then finally, for those of you who are students, I've said some things that are not positive, as you can tell, about the intelligence community. Some things that are happening that are, I think, problematic from a number of perspectives. But the intelligence world is still important. It still does an important function. There still are lots of rewards there. The kinds of things that attracted lots of people and attracted me are still there. But the politicization issue is important. It's also internal. So even if you like the changes that have been made, and clearly a lot of IC employees do, they like it for either philosophical reasons or because the new policies literally, materially help them. But in any case, the tensions that have been created will affect everyone. And if you're not someone who agrees with these changes, it's crystal clear that that publicly saying that at this stage will be career damaging. So you'll want to be careful about what you say at all the agencies. My suggestion is that if you're thinking about seriously the career option of going to work in the intelligence community, that you learn a lot, learn as much as you possibly can, talk with lots of people from different perspectives, different job backgrounds, and so on. And once you've learned as much as you possibly can, make career choices with open eyes and full information. And good luck to you. So.